state and life cycle. There are 3 things you should know about setState. Do not modify state directly. For example, this will not re-render a component. Wrong equals hello. Instead, use setState. The only place where you can assign this .state is the constructor. State updates may be asynchronous. React may batch multiple setState calls into a single update for performance. Because this .props and this .state may be updated asynchronously, you should not rely on their values for calculating the next state. To fix it, use a second form of setState that accepts a function rather than an object. That function will receive the previous state as the first argument, and the props at the time the update is applied as the second argument. State updates are merged. When you call setState, React merges the object you provide into the current state. For example, your state may contain several independent variables. Then you can update them independently with separate setState calls. The merging is shallow. The data flows down. Neither parent nor child components can know if a certain component is stateful or stateless, and they shouldn't care whether it is defined as a function or a class. This is why state is often called local or encapsulated. It is not accessible to any component other than the one that owns and sets it. A component may choose to pass its state down as props to its child components. This is commonly called a top-down or unidirectional data flow. Any state is always owned by some specific component, and any data or IE derived from that state can only affect components below them in the tree. If you imagine a component tree as a waterfall of props, each component's state is like an additional water source that joins it at an arbitrary point but also flows down. In React apps, whether a component is stateful or stateless is considered an implementation detail of the component that may change over time. You can use stateless components inside stateful components, and vice versa. Handling events. Handling events with React elements is very similar to handling events on DOM elements. There are some syntax differences. React events are named using camel case, rather than lowercase. With JSX you pass a function as the event handler, rather than a string. Another difference is that you cannot return false to prevent default behavior in React. You must call prevent default explicitly. Here, E is a synthetic event. React defines these synthetic events according to the W3C spec, so you don't need to worry about cross-browser compatibility. React events do not work exactly the same as native events. See the Synthesis Event Reference Guide to learn more. When using React, you generally don't need to call addEventListener to add listeners to a DOM element after it is created. Instead, just provide a listener when the element is initially rendered. When you define a component using an ES6 class, a common pattern is for an event handler to be a method on the class. For example, this toggle component renders a button that lets the user toggle between on and off states. You have to be careful about the meaning of this in JSX callbacks. In JavaScript, class methods are not bound by default. If you forget to bind this .handleClick and pass it to onClick, this will be undefined when the function is actually called. This is not React-specific behavior. It is a part of how functions work in JavaScript. Generally, if you refer to a method without after it, such as onClick equals, you should bind that method. If calling bind annoys you, There are two ways you can get around this. If you are using the experimental public class fields syntax, you can use class fields to correctly bind callback. This syntax is enabled by default in Create React App. If you aren't using class fields syntax, you can use an arrow function in the callback. The problem with this syntax is that a different callback is created each time the logging button renders. In most cases, this is fine. However, if this callback is passed as a prop to lower components, those components might do an extra array rendering. We generally recommend binding in the constructor or using the class fields syntax to avoid this sort of performance problem. Passing arguments to event handlers. Inside a loop, it is common to want to pass an extra parameter to an event handler. For example, if it is the row ID, either of the following would work. greater than delete row. Delete row. The above two lines are equivalent, and use arrow functions and function.prototype.bind respectively. In both cases, the argument representing the React event will be passed as a second argument after the ID. With an arrow function, we have to pass it explicitly, but with bind any further arguments are automatically forwarded.